Previous segment, I want to talk a little bit about developing economies and climate change. And this is an issue I think I've actually touched on before, but it's important to remind everyone about this, especially as we get new context about reporting coming in from other countries. So, first of all, let's talk about what a developing economy is. So, a developing economy is typically an economy that does not have modern amenities. So, think about things like universal running water or universal electricity, relies on coal primarily for its power, where there is power. And oftentimes, these societies are mainly agrarian or agricultural societies with some information technology and manufacturing mixed in. But oftentimes, even those things are missing from developing economies. It depends. Developing economies covers a wide range of economies that deal with a variety of different countries experiencing lots of different things. And there's a huge scale. And also, developing economies doesn't refer to whole nation states. Sometimes within a country, you will have both developed and developing economies simultaneously. So you could say overall that India is a developing economy. However, there are large cities where they have most of the amenities that modern developed economies typically have. But on the other hand, there are also parts of that country where there are clearly not those types of resources. Okay, so I just want to give you a sense of what developing economy means, and that it isn't a it's a catch-all. So it's not an exact measure by any stretch of the imagination. But generally speaking, you can think of these countries as typically being poor and without modern luxuries. Okay, but again, that's not a great definition either. Work with me here. Okay, so as the climate gets hotter, many of these nations are going to be affected. So, Madagascar is an excellent example that has come up in the news recently, where despite the fact that the ocean is rising and that there's lots of salt water, it hasn't rained there in years. So, it hasn't rained significantly, I should say, there in years. So, Madagascar is primarily an agrarian economy, which means they need water to grow their plants, or else they can't eat. So mass starvation is setting in because Madagascar can't get the rainwater to produce crops so that individuals can live. Now, Madagascar did not create the climate crisis. They don't have great big coal factories that are pumping out, um, you know, massive amounts of carbon dioxide. They're not pumping CFCs into the air to put holes in the ozone, right? Madagascar is just trying to do its own thing. It's trying to get by, but it's being hit by climate change in two different ways. The first way, of course, is the ocean levels are rising. So people are having to abandon their homes because Madagascar is being swallowed by the ocean. And the second way is while all that water is coming into Madagascar, none of it's usable for arable land. You can't really farm with salt water, and you definitely can't drink it. Not without significant processing, which, by the way, developing economies don't typically have. And by the way, most developed economies, just to be clear, do not have large scale measures for ocean desalination. So this is something that is very important for us to think about in the developed world as well. So people are starting to starve and to move closer and closer together. By the way, the other thing that climate change makes more possible is pandemics. We're currently in a global pandemic, and for a place like Madagascar, where people are having to move closer together because of the lack of resources, well, people moving closer together who did not previously live together is a great way for pandemics to spread. And so we have to think about all the different contexts in which climate change will change our world. Now, of course, Madagascar is just one example, but in many countries throughout the world who are trying to catch up to the developed world, they're experiencing a variety of problems. And I want to take some time to talk about those. So, there is lots of pressure from the developed world on the developing world to develop. And not only is this unfair because the developed world has primarily imposed the conditions of developingness on the developing world, either through colonization or slavery or the mass removal of manpower, or others or some other type of servitude. But when these nations do start to modernize, the easiest ways for them to modernize are through the use of fossil fuels because those can be extracted. They don't require very expensive parts like silicone for solar panels or the types of engines you need for wind turbines and geothermal and different turbines you need for um, tidal power or hydropower or geothermal power or what have you, right? So the easiest and cheapest way for them to develop is by using fossil fuels, which of course contributes to the climate crisis. But then, now, because we're in a climate crisis, the world turns to these developing nations and says, oh, well, you should use more green energy. Well, obviously, that's not fair because they are essentially just arriving to a stage of um, modernization that has existed in many of the developed countries for decades, if not centuries. But this pressure is being continued to be imposed on them because we're in crisis mode. So, there is a way to get around this, of course, which is to actually force the richer countries who are producing more carbon dioxide to totally switch off to go carbon negative in their production of electricity and power and whatnot, and to allow those developing countries to develop the traditional way, but to assist them in moving quickly from carbon emitting resources of power to non carbon emitting resources of power. But that will take a concerted effort, right? And of course, because many of these rich countries, developed countries, are actually profiting from sending their dirty fuel over to these slowly developing countries, there is an incentive to not move them off of that path. But at the same time, to use pedantic rhetoric to make them feel as if that they are contributing to a crisis for which is affecting them the most and for which they have contributed the least. So that's an additional pressure that they are feeling. And as we continue to go through this cycle, it's important to remember that if you compare any developed and any developing country, and I mean in a situation where the whole country is more or less developed and the whole country is more or less developing, oftentimes there's an incredible power dynamic there which has allowed for the developed country to either use the resources or manpower of the developing country to accelerate its development. It's hard to say, looking back at it, whether we would be in the situation we are in today, technology wise, if there hadn't been a large scale uh, theft of resources and manpower from Africa to um, what became the United States and Europe. But that amount of manpower and allowed for those nations, and by the way, the theft of natural resources as well, allowed for those nations to get a head start on those nations that we intentionally left behind, that we either subjugated later or colonized or what have you. So it's hard to say if we hadn't done that, if we'd have as much technology as we have now. But the truth is, it doesn't really matter because we can't go back and fix it. But even if it did mean that we had fewer technologies today, it would make more sense for the world to have grown up industrially together. Because although it would have meant more of a carbon footprint earlier, it also would have meant that as new technologies for reducing carbon emissions came out, they would be more equally spread out through the world, and we could more quickly deal with the climate crisis. Additionally, it would also mean that we don't have to worry as much about acting as a collective unit. Now, of course, we should always act collectively for large scale crises, but if each country had the resources and was developing more or less at the same technological timescale, then you could use essentially selfish measures to make sure that you developed at either the same pace or at a faster pace than your neighbor because everyone was developing more or less the same way. There wouldn't have been a large theft of resources and manpower over the course of centuries. Obviously, we can't fix that. But we also cannot take the stance that those countries that are developing, that are desperately just trying to get to the level of technology that we had 100 years ago, we cannot blame them for the climate crisis because doing so is disingenuous and it's unfair. We in the rich nations are the ones that have contributed the most to climate change. And to hold developing nations accountable for our mistakes, our sins, something that we can fix if we really want to, is just wrong. So, as we continue to ponder solutions to climate change, we have to remember that this has to be driven by rich countries. This cannot be driven by developing countries. As I mentioned in the last segment, the only country presently that is keeping on target for their Paris Climate Accord goals is the Gambia. The Gambia has not contributed almost anything to climate change, which is partially probably why it is easier for them to keep to their climate targets. At the same time, rich nations who produce the vast majority of carbon emissions need to fundamentally shift what they're doing to go carbon neutral or carbon negative so that we give developing nations the industrial and carbon allowance room that they need to develop the more modern technologies. And by the way, now that we have all these resources that we, by the way, more or less got from them or are benefiting from resources we got from these developing nations, it is now our responsibility, our right to help these developing nations develop and to push them through the narrow funnel of fossil fuels as soon as possible to make sure that if they do have to use fossil fuels, that they do so for a small amount of time and that we give them the resources to industrialize and to modernize like we did, but in a much smaller time scale. In truth, and just to kind of cap off these two climate change stories, we're running out of time. We don't have much of a choice any longer. We have to take fundamental action. How we do that, I hope I've outlined on this show enough times. But playing the blame game and pussyfooting around the answer is not going to cut it. Humanity's existence and the existence of many of the species that we know and love is on the brink. This planet will be fine without us, but we will not be fine without this planet. We have to do our part to make sure that we allow for everyone to get climate justice. Climate justice cannot just be reserved for the rich nations, because then it's not justice at all. It's climate supremacy, and it's just as bad as anything that you can think of that is any other type of supremacy. It means genocide. It means war. It means death. And if you're not okay with that, then we need to push a lot harder to change our world and to change it soon.